Navon, thank you very much for speaking to us here on the channel. Israeli forces say they've killed 4 alleged militants in Rafah after they emerged from an underground tunnel and opened fire on IDF troops. How common are these violations? Because one, of course, could say that there's allegations on both sides of as this ceasefire remains particularly fragile. And what are your hopes for the stabilization of Phase 2, given the nature that Stage 1 has been carried out?
Well, I think we got an answer yesterday from senior Hamas terrorist Khaled Mashhad, who said very clearly and openly that Hamas has absolutely no intention of laying down its arms and of disarming the Gaza Strip. So I think the intentions of Hamas are very clear. It wants to hold on any territory that it still controls in the Gaza Strip. It refuses to lay down its arms despite the catastrophe that it has brought upon the residents of Gaza, and despite the complete defeat of Hamas. It is still holding on some territory and some weapons, and unfortunately, as long as Hamas refuses to lay down its arms, as it is expected to do by the ceasefire agreement, it will not be possible to move on to the next stages of the ceasefire agreement.
Dr. Navon, of course, one can look at the statistics and the figures that are coming out of the Gaza Health Ministry and say at least 576 Palestinians have now been killed by Israeli strikes or fire since the ceasefire went into effect on October the 10th of last year. 4 Israeli soldiers have been killed in the same amount of time. What does this say about how and when Israel are using such weaponry and force against Hamas, given the sheer difference in number? Of course, Israel is the more technologically advanced when it comes to its weapons, etc. So how does the Israeli state dignify that huge difference in numbers there?
Well, first of all, this figure has zero credibility. You yourself said, according to the health ministry in Gaza, that of course that health ministry is controlled by Hamas, and therefore those figures are produced by Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization recognized as such by most countries in the world. It has lied repeatedly about those figures since the beginning of the war, and therefore any figure provided by Hamas under the false cover of the Gaza Health Ministry have zero credibility. Now, there have been many instances...
Dr. Navon, of course, this came after senior Israeli military officials for the first time said that Israel accepts that around 70,000 Palestinians have been killed during the Gaza war. If that figure was accurate, why isn't this one?
Well, first of all, the figure of 70,000 was not necessarily produced by Hamas, but the one you gave right now specifically of 500, as I said, comes from Hamas. Now, there are in fact in Israel itself different estimations. There is no consensus among Israeli military experts about the exact number of victims on the Gaza side in the war that ended, partially at least, in October. But when Hamas supplies figures, these are simply not reliable. This is not to say, of course, that there are no side victims to the continued violation of the ceasefire by Hamas. There are such victims, but all I'm saying is that the figures have to be taken with a pinch of salt, definitely when it comes from Hamas. Now, we know that many Hamas terrorists have been violating the agreement, have been crossing the line between the Hamas-held territory and the Israeli-held territory, and therefore Israel has no other choice but to retaliate when this line is being crossed.
Okay, but of course, those numbers which literally came out a few days ago, the senior Israeli Defense Force officials, they briefed journalists and the media that Israel's own data shows 70 1,000 Palestinians killed in October, plus killed since October 2023. A figure of which, of course, is really similar to Gaza's health ministry tally. If Gaza's health ministry was telling the truth then and agree with the Israeli officials, why aren't they telling the truth now?
Well, when it comes to Hamas, the reliability of its figures has always to be taken with skepticism. And as I said before, even the figures of 70,000, there's no consensus in Israel about that figure. But at the end of the day, we also have to look at the wider picture, which is the ratio between civilian and military victims in zones of conflict, in zones of war. And the ratio of civilians to military is, in fact, lower in that war than it was in areas of combat led by NATO forces in Iraq and in Syria. And this is in a very densely populated area. So even though every human death is a tragedy, the fact is that for such a densely populated zone with underground fighting, the ratio of civilian to military casualties in that war is actually lower proportionally than it was in areas of fighting where NATO forces were involved in the Middle East.
Dr. Navon, those numbers are very much disputed, of course, by various agencies, by various international actors. These things could be checked if international journalists, international bodies were let inside Gaza to check these things, to make sure these things are rigorous. Do you think it's time that happens?
Well, I think that now that a ceasefire has been reached, first of all, there are more journalists who've been allowed in the Gaza Strip. It's still a very dangerous area, but don't forget that Israel only controls about half of the territory of the Gaza Strip at this point. And in the area controlled by Hamas, any claims about the ability or the inability of journalists to enter have to be brought to Hamas itself, which still controls about half of the Strip. The one that is controlled by Israel, still controlled by Israel, there have been more journalists visiting those areas. Maybe there should be more. But as I said, as of the ceasefire in October, Israel has retained control on about half of the Gaza Strip, and not all of it.
Dr. Emmanuel Navon, thank you so much for joining us here on NewsX World and taking the time.